The outcast. The bustling alien marketplace hummed with activity, a chaotic blend of sounds, lights, and smells. Traders shouted out prices in strange languages. Customers haggled over goods, and the air shimmered with the glow of alien technologies. In the midst of all this, Pixa stood quietly, her small frame barely noticeable among the towering alien species that filled the market. Pixa was no more than 3 feet tall, with pale green skin and wide, shimmering eyes that reflected the bright lights around her. Her tiny hands clutched the edge of her worn cloak, a feeble attempt to shield herself from the judging gazes of the crowd. She stood on a raised platform, her name written in crude letters on a holographic sign that floated above her head. For sale, defective specimen. Nobody stopped to look at her. Some sneered, others laughed, and a few glanced her way with pity before moving on. She wasn't the only one up for auction that day, but she was the only one nobody wanted. "She's useless," muttered a tall, insectoid merchant as he passed by. His antennae twitched in disdain. Not even worth a single credit. Pixa heard every word. She had grown used to it over the years, but that didn't make it hurt any less. Her people had abandoned her long ago, leaving her to survive in a galaxy that had no place for the weak or unwanted. She wrapped her cloak tighter around herself, wishing she could disappear. Just as the auctioneer, a rotund alien with slimy blue skin, was about to move on to the next item, a voice cut through the noise. "I'll take her." The crowd fell silent, heads turning to see who had spoken. A man stepped forward, his boots clicking against the metallic ground. He was human, tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in a simple jacket that had clearly seen better days. His face was weathered, with a faint scar running along his jawline, but his eyes were sharp and steady. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. "You want her?" he asked, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The man nodded. "How much?" The auctioneer scratched his slimy chin. 10 credits." A murmur ran through the crowd. 10 credits was practically nothing, and even that seemed too much for someone like Pixa. But the human didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of coins, and handed them over. The auctioneer shrugged and motioned for Pixa to step down. "She's all yours, human." Pixa stared at the man in disbelief. Nobody had ever wanted her before. Why would a human, someone she had only heard stories about, pay for her? Was this some kind of cruel joke? "Well," the man said, his voice firm but not unkind, "are you coming, or do you want to stay here?" His words snapped her out of her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped off the platform and followed him. The crowd parted as they walked, whispers trailing behind them. "Humans are strange," someone muttered. "Maybe he's desperate," another said with a chuckle. Pixa's heart raced as she hurried to keep up with the man's long strides. She had no idea where he was taking her, but it wasn't like she had a choice. Anywhere was better than being left behind in that market. After a few minutes, they reached the edge of the marketplace, where a small, battered starship waited. The human pressed a button on his wristband, and the ship's ramp lowered with a soft hiss. He gestured for her to go inside. "Go on," he said. "You're safe here." Safe. The word felt foreign to her, almost like a lie. But something in his voice made her want to believe it. She stepped onto the ship, her bare feet making no sound against the cool metal floor. The interior was small but clean, with a cockpit at the front and a few seats lined along the walls. The man followed her inside and closed the ramp behind them. He turned to face her, crossing his arms. "Name's Jack," he said. "What's yours?" "P. Pixa," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Well, Pixa," Jack said, crouching down so he was at eye level with her. "You're not a prisoner here. You can leave any time you want. But if you stick around, there are a few rules. First, don't touch anything in the cockpit. Second, don't try to run off in the middle of a job. And third," he paused, his expression softening, "you don't have to be scared anymore." Pixa stared at him, her wide eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. All she saw was honesty. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, small and fragile, but there. Jack stood up and ruffled her hair gently. "Get some rest," he said. "You look like you need it." As he walked away toward the cockpit, Pixa sat down on one of the seats, clutching her cloak tightly. She didn't know why Jack had chosen to help her or what he expected in return. But for now, she was warm, safe, and away from the marketplace. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope that things might get better. The bond. The hum of the ship's engines was a soothing backdrop as Pixa sat in a corner of the small living quarters, her tiny frame dwarfed by the oversized chair she perched on. She still clung to her worn cloak, as though it could protect her from the unfamiliar surroundings. The room was modest, barely large enough to hold a bunk, a small table, and a storage locker, but to Pixa, it felt like a palace compared to the cramped, dirty streets of the alien marketplace. Jack moved around the room with practiced ease, unpacking supplies and setting up a meal on the table. He seemed calm, as though picking up a stray alien girl was just another day for him. Pixa couldn't understand him. Why had he taken her in? What did he want from her? No one did anything for free in this galaxy. Hungry, Jack's voice broke her thoughts. He held out a bowl of steaming stew, the aroma rich and inviting. Pixa hesitated, her large eyes darting between Jack and the bowl. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Her hands gripped the edge of the chair as if she expected him to snatch the bowl away. Jack sighed and placed the bowl on the table. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "Not everyone's out to hurt you, kid," he said. "I've seen enough people get kicked down by the galaxy to know when someone needs a hand." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Pixa's chest tighten. She slid off the chair and approached the table cautiously, as though the food might vanish if she got too close. When Jack didn't move, she picked up the bowl and took a small sip. The warmth of the stew spread through her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of comfort. Jack watched her with a small smile. "See, not so bad, is it?" She glanced up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're strange for a human." Jack laughed, a deep, genuine sound that filled the small room. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the meal continued, Pixa found herself relaxing, though she still kept a wary eye on Jack. He didn't ask her any questions or try to pry into her past, which surprised her. Most people wanted something. Instead, he talked about the ship, explaining its quirks and systems as if he were introducing her to an old friend. "This here's the Iron Will," he said, gesturing to the walls. "She's not the fastest ship in the galaxy, but she's tough. Gets the job done." "What kind of jobs?" Pixa asked, her voice hesitant. Jack shrugged. "Mostly cargo runs. Sometimes a little problem-solving." He smirked, but there was a hint of something darker in his tone. "Let's just say the galaxy doesn't always play fair, and I don't mind evening the odds." Pixa didn't know what he meant, but she decided not to ask. Instead, she focused on her stew, savoring every bite. It was the first real meal she'd had in weeks. After they finished eating, Jack leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he said quietly. Pixa stiffened, her grip tightening on the empty bowl. "I don't want to talk about it." "Fair enough," Jack said, raising his hands in surrender. "I won't push. But if you ever need to talk, I'm here." The kindness in his voice unsettled her. It wasn't something she was used to. She wanted to trust him, but a part of her kept screaming that it was all a trick. Still, she couldn't ignore the small part of her that desperately wanted to believe he was genuine. As the evening wore on, Jack showed her to a small bunk tucked into the corner of the ship. "It's not much," he said, "but it's better than a marketplace floor." Pixa nodded, her fingers brushing against the soft blanket. She climbed onto the bunk, her tiny form barely taking up half the space. As she lay down, she watched Jack through half-closed eyes. He sat at the control panel, adjusting the ship's course. His movements were precise, his focus unwavering. He didn't look like someone who would betray her, but she had been wrong about people before. Before she drifted off to sleep, a thought crossed her mind, a question she hadn't dared to ask earlier. "Jack?" she called out softly. He turned in his chair, his expression curious. "Yeah." "Why me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You could have picked anyone. Why did you save me?" Jack leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Because nobody else would," he said simply. "And sometimes, the ones nobody wants are the ones who deserve it the most." Pixa didn't know how to respond to that. She curled up under the blanket, her heart heavy but strangely warm. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't entirely alone. As the ship sailed through the quiet void of space, Pixa stared at the ceiling, her mind swirling with questions and uncertainties. But one thing was clear: Jack was different, and maybe, just maybe, her life was about to change. The threat. The iron will sailed through the quiet, endless expanse of space, its engines humming steadily. Inside, Pixa found herself growing accustomed to the strange yet oddly comforting environment of Jack's ship. She had even started to let her guard down, enjoying the safety she hadn't felt in years. But the galaxy was never kind for long. It started as a faint blip on the ship's radar. Jack was seated in the cockpit, his boots propped up on the control panel, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Pixa sat nearby, watching the stars through the viewport, her wide eyes filled with wonder. "Why do they look so different out here?" she asked, her voice soft. Jack glanced at her, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Out here, there's nothing to block your view. No pollution, no noise, just the real thing." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the sparkling stars. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, until a sharp beeping shattered the calm. Jack's boots hit the floor with a thud as he leaned forward, scanning the controls. His brow furrowed, and the easygoing air around him vanished, replaced by sharp focus. "What is it?" Pixa asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. "Trouble," Jack muttered. He tapped a few buttons, and the radar display expanded, showing a cluster of ships heading their way. "Looks like raiders. 3 of them." Pixa's heart raced. She had heard stories about raiders, merciless pirates who scavenged the galaxy, taking what they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. "Why are they coming after us?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He was too busy flipping switches and adjusting their course. "They're after me," he said finally, "or what I'm carrying. Either way, they won't stop until they get it." "What are you carrying?" she asked, her voice rising with panic. Jack glanced at her, his expression grim. "Nothing worth dying over. But raiders don't care." The ship shuddered as a warning shot skimmed past them, lighting up the viewport with a bright flash. Pixa gasped, clutching the edge of her seat. Jack cursed under his breath, his hands flying over the controls. "Hang on, kid," he said. "This is gonna get bumpy." The iron will dove sharply, evading another volley of laser fire. Pixa clung to her seat, her small frame jolting with every movement. The raiders were closing in, their ships sleek and predatory, like wolves circling their prey. Jack flipped a switch, and the ship's internal lights dimmed. "Engaging stealth mode," he muttered. "Let's see if we can lose them." The ship's engines quieted, and the iron will slipped into the shadows of a nearby asteroid field. Jack navigated the dense cluster with expert precision, weaving between the massive rocks as the raiders' ships searched the area. Pixa held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched as Jack's hands moved with practiced ease, his face a mask of concentration. For the first time, she saw him not just as her strange savior, but as someone who had faced danger before, someone who knew how to survive. "Almost clear," Jack murmured, his eyes fixed on the radar. But just as they neared the edge of the asteroid field, one of the raider ships appeared ahead, blocking their path. They found us, Pixa cried, panic rising in her voice. Jack didn't flinch, not for long. With a flick of a switch, the iron will surged forward, its engines roaring back to life. Jack spun the ship in a tight arc, dodging a barrage of laser fire. The raider ship gave chase, its weapons blazing, but Jack stayed one step ahead, his movements precise and unyielding. Pixa, he called over the noise, I need you to trust me. Go to the panel behind you and flip the red lever. Pixa hesitated, her hands shaking. What will it do? It'll buy us time. Now go. She scrambled to the panel, her fingers fumbling over the controls. The red lever felt heavy as she pulled it down, and a loud clunk echoed through the ship. Moments later, a burst of bright flares shot out from the iron will, scattering in every direction. The raider ship hesitated, its sensors momentarily blinded by the flares. Jack seized the opportunity, pushing the iron will to full speed and escaping the asteroid field. By the time the raiders regained their bearings, the iron will was long gone, its trail lost in the vastness of space. Pixa slumped against the wall, her breaths coming in short gasps. Are we safe? She asked. Jack leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. For now, he said, but they'll keep coming. They always do. Why do they want you so badly? Pixa's voice was quiet, but the fear was clear. Jack turned to her, his expression unreadable. Let's just say I've made some enemies in my time. But don't worry, kid. I won't let anything happen to you. Despite his reassuring words, Pixa couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. For the first time, she realized the weight of the danger they were in, and the cost Jack might have to pay to keep her safe. The revelation. The silence in the cockpit of the iron will was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's systems. Pixa sat cross-legged on the floor, her small frame tense as she watched Jack inspect the ship's damage. The recent encounter with the raiders had left scorch marks on the hull and fried part of the secondary engine. Jack moved with precision, a toolkit by his side, his jaw tight as he worked. How bad is it? Pixa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't look up. Bad enough, he muttered. We've got one engine running at half capacity, and the shields are down to 20%. We'll need to find a station soon, or we're sitting ducks. Pixa hugged her knees to her chest, her wide eyes filled with worry. Why don't you just tell them what they want? Maybe they'll leave us alone. Jack froze for a moment, his grip tightening on the wrench in his hand. He set it down carefully before turning to face her. It's not that simple, Pixa, he said, his voice heavy. If I give them what they want, it's not just me they'll come after. It'll be anyone connected to me. People who don't deserve to get hurt. But why? Pixa pressed. Why are they after you? What are you hiding? Jack sighed and leaned back against the wall, wiping sweat from his brow. You deserve to know, he said after a long pause. But it's not a pretty story. Pixa straightened, her curiosity outweighing her fear. She had spent her life being told nothing, always left in the dark about the decisions made for her. If Jack was willing to share, she would listen. I used to be part of the Galactic Peace Corps, Jack began, his tone bitter. Sounds noble, right? Protecting the galaxy, maintaining order. But the truth is, it's just a front for a corrupt system. The Corps doesn't care about peace, they care about control. Pixa tilted her head, her small brow furrowing. What do you mean? Jack's gaze grew distant, his mind drifting back to memories he'd rather forget. I followed orders blindly for years, thinking I was doing the right thing. But then they sent me on a mission to a small colony. They said the people there were harboring dangerous fugitives and needed to be neutralized. His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed on. When we arrived, there were no fugitives, just families, kids, people trying to live their lives. Pixa's breath hitched. She could see the pain in his eyes, the guilt he carried like a weight on his shoulders. What did you do? I refused, Jack said simply. I stood between my squad and those people and told them I wouldn't be a part of it. They called me a traitor, shot me, and left me for dead. But I survived. I've been running ever since, trying to make up for the things I didn't stop sooner. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken horrors of Jack's past. Pixa felt a pang of understanding. She, too, knew what it was like to be cast aside, labeled as worthless by those who should have protected her. That's why they're after me, Jack continued. I've got information, files on what the corpse has done, the people they hurt. If those files get out, it'll expose them. But it also puts a target on my back. Pixa stared at him, her mind racing. What about me? She asked softly. Why did you save me? Jack looked at her, his expression softening. Because you remind me of those people on the colony, he said. Innocent, abandoned, treated like you don't matter. But you do, Pixa. You matter. Her chest tightened at his words, emotion she had buried for years rising to the surface. No one had ever told her she mattered before. It felt like a foreign concept, but one she wanted desperately to believe. Jack stood and stretched, his usual calm demeanor returning. We've got to move, he said. There's a station not far from here where we can refuel and make some repairs. But it's risky. Why risky? Pixa asked, standing as well. Because places like that are full of eyes and ears, Jack replied. If anyone recognizes me, or worse, recognizes you, we'll have more trouble than we can handle. Pixa frowned. Me? Why would they care about me? Jack hesitated, the slightest flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. I'm not sure yet, he admitted. But those raiders were tracking us too closely. They weren't just after me. They knew you were on board. Her heart sank. Why would they care about me? I'm just nobody. Jack crouched down so they were eye level, his gaze steady. You're not nobody, Pixa. And I promise we'll figure this out. Together. The weight of his words settled over her, a strange mix of fear and comfort. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing the galaxy alone. But she couldn't shake the feeling that her past, the one she had tried so hard to forget, was about to catch up with her. And when it did, she wasn't sure either of them would survive. The chase. The iron will limp through the star-filled void, its damaged engines whining with each burst of acceleration. Jack sat at the controls, his jaw clenched as he pushed the ship harder than it was meant to go. The station was still a few light years away, and every second felt like an eternity. Pixa sat in the co-pilot's seat, her small hands gripping the armrests. She had never seen Jack look so tense before, and it made her stomach churn with unease. The tension in the air was as thick as the smoke that occasionally hissed from the overheated console. Jack, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, do you think we'll make it? He glanced at her, the usual warmth in his eyes replaced with a cold, calculating focus. We don't have a choice, kid. If we stop, they'll catch us. If we keep going, we've got a shot. As if on cue, the radar beeped again, a shrill reminder that the raiders weren't far behind. 3 red dots blinked on the screen, growing closer with every passing minute. Jack's fingers danced over the controls, adjusting their trajectory and rerouting power to the engines. They're gaining on us, Pixa said, her voice trembling. I know, Jack replied. Hold on. He flipped a switch, and the iron will surged forward, the stars outside the viewport streaking into lines of light. The ship groaned in protest, its damaged systems straining under the pressure. Pixa could feel the vibrations through her seat, each one a reminder of how close they were to falling apart. The raiders didn't relent. Their sleek, predatory ships darted through space with ease, firing bursts of energy that lit up the void. Jack twisted the iron will into a tight barrel roll, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. The sudden movement sent Pixa tumbling out of her seat, and she scrambled to grab onto the edge of the console. You okay? Jack asked, not taking his eyes off the controls. I'm fine, she shouted back, though her heart was pounding in her chest. Good, Because I'm going to need your help. Pixa froze. Me? What can I do? Jack pointed to a panel on the wall. See that lever? It's tied to the rear thrusters. When I say go, pull it as hard as you can. It'll release a burst of plasma that might slow them down. She nodded, her small legs carrying her quickly to the panel. Her hands hovered over the lever, her palms slick with sweat. Tell me when. Jack's gaze flicked to the radar. The raiders were practically breathing down their necks. Wait. Now. Pixa yanked the lever with all her strength. A low rumble shook the ship as a burst of glowing plasma erupted from the rear thrusters. The pursuing ships veered wildly, one of them spinning out of control and disappearing into the darkness. Nice work, kid, Jack called out, a hint of pride in his voice. But the victory was short-lived. The two remaining raider ships adjusted their course, their weapons locking onto the iron will once more. Pixa stumbled back to her seat, her hands trembling. They're not giving up, she said, her voice small. They never do, Jack replied grimly. But neither do I. He pulled the ship into a sharp dive, heading straight for a nearby asteroid belt. The jagged rocks loomed ahead, spinning slowly in the void. Pixa's eyes widened as they drew closer, the asteroids growing larger and more menacing with each second. Are you crazy? She shouted. We'll get crushed. Not if we're lucky, Jack said. And I'm feeling lucky today. The iron will plunged into the asteroid field, weaving through the massive rocks with barely an inch to spare. Jack's hands were steady on the controls, his focus unshakable. Pixa held her breath, her knuckles white, as she gripped the armrests. Behind them, the raiders followed, their ships more agile but not as cautious. One of the raider ships clipped an asteroid, its hull crumpling before it exploded in a fiery burst. The debris scattered, forcing the last ship to pull back momentarily. 2 down, Jack muttered. 1 to go. But the final raider was relentless. It dodged and weaved through the asteroid field with alarming precision, closing the gap between them. Jack pushed the iron will harder, the ship shuddering with every maneuver. We're not going to make it, Pixa whispered, her voice trembling. Don't say that, Jack snapped. We're not done yet. He reached for a hidden switch on the console, his movements quick and deliberate. Pixa, remember what I said about the emergency boosters? She nodded, though she didn't fully understand. Yeah. Well, we're about to use them. Hold on to something. Before she could respond, Jack flipped the switch. The iron will roared to life, its engines blasting at full power. The sudden acceleration slammed Pixa back into her seat, her vision blurring as the ship shot forward like a comet. The asteroid field fell away behind them, and the open expanse of space stretched out ahead. The radar beeped once, then went silent. Pixa dared to glance at the screen. The final raider ship was gone, left behind in the chaos of the asteroid belt. We did it, she said, her voice filled with disbelief. We actually did it. Jack leaned back in his seat, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Yeah, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. But we're not out of the woods yet. Pixa didn't need him to explain. The damage to the iron will was worse than ever, and the station was still hours away. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. As the ship drifted through the quiet void, Pixa turned to Jack, her expression serious. Why do you keep risking so much for me? She asked. Jack met her gaze, his eyes steady. Because, kid, you're worth it. Even if you don't see it yet. Her chest tightened at his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. The stand. The iron will finally limp to a small barren planet orbiting a dying red star. Its desolate surface was covered in jagged cliffs and shifting sands, a far cry from the bustling spaceports Jack usually aimed for. But here, at least they could hide, regroup, and make temporary repairs. The ship descended onto a flat plateau, its damaged engine sputtering as it touched down. Pixa followed Jack down the ship's ramp, her small feet sinking into the gritty sand. The planet's atmosphere was thin but breathable, and the air carried a strange metallic tang. She glanced around nervously, her wide eyes scanning the horizon. The landscape seemed empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching. "Why here?" Pixa asked, hugging her cloak tightly around her. Jack adjusted the blaster holstered at his side, his gaze sweeping over the terrain. "Because it's off the charts. Raiders won't think to look here, and even if they do, the terrain gives us the advantage." Pixa frowned. Advantage? Against ships and weapons. Jack crouched down, drawing a crude map in the sand with his finger. "See these cliffs? They create natural choke points. If they find us, they'll have to come in on foot. We'll set traps, force them into tight spaces, and take them out one by one." Pixa stared at him, her brow furrowed. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," Jack admitted, standing up and brushing the sand off his hands. "But it's better than sitting around waiting to die." She nodded reluctantly, following him as he began gathering materials from the ship. Jack worked quickly, setting up crude defenses using the limited supplies they had. He rigged motion sensors near the cliffs, laid tripwires across narrow paths, and crafted explosive charges from leftover ship fuel. Pixa helped where she could, her nimble fingers tying knots and adjusting wires under Jack's instructions. As they worked, a question burned in her mind, one she could no longer ignore. "Jack," she said hesitantly, "why do you keep fighting? You could have given them what they wanted and walked away. Why risk everything? For me. For this." Jack paused, his hand stilling over the charge he was setting. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Because I've already walked away before," he said quietly. "And it cost lives. This time, I'm not running. Not when I can do something about it." His words hung heavy in the air, and Pixa felt a strange mix of fear and admiration. Jack wasn't just a rogue or a fugitive. He was someone who refused to give up, no matter the odds. It made her want to fight too. Hours later, as the twin moons rose over the barren landscape, the first warning came. The motion sensors near the cliffs beeped faintly, signaling movement. Jack and Pixa crouched in the shadows of the ship, their eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "They're here," Jack said grimly, his hand resting on the blaster at his side. Pixa's heart pounded in her chest. She could see the faint glimmers of lights in the distance, headlamps and weapons glinting under the pale moonlight. The raiders had arrived, and they weren't wasting time. Their ships hovered just above the ground, releasing squads of heavily armed fighters who spread out across the rocky terrain. "Stick to the plan," Jack whispered, his voice steady. "I'll draw them into the traps. You stay hidden, and hit the detonators when I signal." Pixa nodded, clutching the remote detonator tightly in her hands. Her palms were sweaty, and her breaths came in shallow bursts, but she forced herself to focus. Jack gave her a reassuring nod before disappearing into the shadows. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse. Jack moved like a ghost, leading the raiders deeper into the cliffs. Explosions rocked the air as the traps were triggered one by one, sending plumes of fire and debris into the sky. Pixa watched from her hiding spot, her fingers trembling as she pressed the detonator buttons on cue. The raiders were relentless, their shouts echoing through the cliffs as they regrouped and pressed on. Pixa could see them growing more cautious, their movements slower as they realized they were walking into a trap. But then, something changed. A new sound filled the air, the deep, ominous hum of an approaching ship. Pixa's stomach dropped as she saw the massive silhouette of a raider command vessel descending over the plateau. "Jack," she whispered into the comm device he had given her. "I see it," his voice crackled back. "Stay put. I'm handling it." Pixa's grip on the comm tightened. How could he possibly handle something that big? She wanted to run to him, to help, but she knew she'd only get in the way. From her vantage point, she saw Jack climb to a higher ridge, his silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. He raised his blaster, taking out a cluster of raiders with precise shots. But the command vessel's guns swiveled toward him, firing bursts of energy that sent chunks of rock flying. Pix's heart raced as she realized he couldn't do this alone. She looked at the detonator in her hands, then at the ship's fuel tanks, which Jack had hidden near the ridge earlier. If she could get close enough to set them off, it might take out the vessel. Summoning every ounce of courage, she crept out of her hiding spot and darted toward the tanks, her small frame making her nearly invisible in the chaos. The sound of gunfire and explosions filled her ears, but she kept moving, her eyes fixed on the target. When she reached the tanks, she fumbled with the charges, her hands shaking. Come on, she muttered under her breath. Pixa, what are you doing? Jack's voice crackled through the comm, sharp with alarm. Helping, she replied, her voice firm. Before Jack could argue, she activated the charges and sprinted back toward cover. The explosion that followed was deafening, a massive fireball engulfing the command vessel. The shockwave knocked her off her feet, and she hit the ground hard, her vision swimming. When she opened her eyes, the battlefield was eerily silent. The raiders were retreating, their forces scattered and broken. Jack appeared moments later, his face a mix of relief and anger. Pixa, he said, kneeling beside her. What were you thinking? She gave him a faint smile, her voice weak but steady. I was thinking, you don't have to do it alone. Jack sighed, pulling her into a gentle hug. You're braver than you realize, kid, he said, but don't scare me like that again. As the dawn broke over the desolate planet, the two of them stood side by side, battered but alive. They had won this battle, but they both knew the fight wasn't over. Together, though, they were ready for whatever came next. The champion. The battlefield was quiet now, the chaos of the raider assault reduced to smoldering wreckage scattered across the desolate plateau. The once silent planet bore the scars of their stand, blackened craters, twisted shards of metal, and the faint glow of dying fires. In the eerie calm, Pixa stood beside Jack, her small frame silhouetted against the rising sun. Her hands trembled as she stared at the destruction they had wrought. She had never imagined she could do something so devastating. And yet, when she looked at Jack, she saw no regret in his eyes, only a hardened resolve. He was already moving, checking their surroundings, securing what little remained of their defenses. We survived, Pixa said softly, as if saying it aloud might make it real. Jack glanced at her, a small smirk playing on his lips despite the exhaustion etched into his face. Yeah, we did. Barely. Pixa watched as he knelt to inspect one of the still-smoking motion sensors. So, what now? She asked. Now, we move, Jack replied. The raiders might be down, but the noise we made here, it won't go unnoticed. We'll have company soon. Pix's stomach nodded at the thought. She didn't want to admit it, but she was scared of what might come next, of how much more they could endure. She glanced at Jack, searching for reassurance. He seemed to sense her unease. Hey, he said, crouching down so they were eye level. We've come this far, haven't we? We'll figure it out. His words were simple, but the steady confidence in his voice made her believe him. She nodded, though 1,000 questions still swirled in her mind. What if more raiders came? What if the Galactic Peace Corps found them? What if? Pixa, Jack said, cutting through her spiraling thoughts. I need you to stay strong. Can you do that for me? She hesitated, then nodded again, more firmly this time. I'll try. That's all I need, he said with a faint smile. Come on, let's get back to the ship. They turned and began the slow trek across the plateau. The iron will loomed ahead, battered and bruised but still standing. Jack moved with purpose, already planning the repairs they would need to get back into the air. Pixa followed close behind, her small feet kicking up clouds of dust as she walked. As they reached the ship, a faint sound broke the silence. The low, rhythmic hum of engines. Jack froze, his hand immediately going to the blaster at his side. Pixa's heart skipped a beat as she followed his gaze to the horizon. A sleek, unfamiliar ship descended from the sky, its metallic hull catching the first rays of sunlight. It landed a few hundred meters away, its landing gear kicking up a cloud of dust. For a moment, there was only silence, and then the ramp lowered. A single figure emerged, clad in lightweight armor that shimmered with an otherworldly hue. The figure was tall, their features sharp and angular, clearly belonging to one of the galaxy's elite species. But it wasn't the figure that drew Pixa's attention. It was the insignia on their chest plate. "That's," she began, her voice trembling. "The Peace Corps," Jack finished grimly, his blaster already drawn. The figure approached slowly, their movements measured and deliberate. When they were close enough to be heard, they stopped and raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "Jack Taylor," they called out, their voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "You've made quite the mess." Jack stepped forward, placing himself protectively between Pixa and the newcomer. "You've got the wrong guy," he said, his tone casual but laced with defiance. "I'm just a pilot." The figure tilted their head, a faint smile playing on their lips. "A pilot who just took down an entire raider battalion and evaded capture for years. Yes, very convincing." "What do you want?" Jack demanded, his grip on the blaster tightening. The figure's gaze shifted to Pixa, and for a moment, their expression softened. "Her," they said simply. "The girl." Pixa felt her blood run cold. She shrank behind Jack, her heart pounding in her chest. "Why?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible. The figure's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was something almost regretful in their expression. "Because you're not just a stray child," they said. "You're the last of your kind, and there are people willing to pay dearly to ensure you don't survive." Jack's jaw tightened. "You're not taking her." The figure sighed, their calm demeanor slipping into something colder. "I was afraid you'd say that." In an instant, Jack fired, the shot narrowly missing as the figure dodged with inhuman speed. The battle that followed was a blur of motion and sound. Blaster fire, shouted commands, and the clash of steel as Jack engaged the figure in hand-to-hand combat. Pixa watched in horror, her small hands clutching the edge of the ship's ramp. She wanted to help, but she didn't know how. Jack was outmatched, and she could see it. The figure moved with precision and power, each strike driving him closer to the edge. And then something snapped inside her. A surge of determination replaced her fear. She remembered the traps they had set, the tools they had used, and the lessons Jack had taught her. She wasn't powerless. Grabbing a makeshift detonator from the ship's supply crate, she sprinted toward the fight. Jack saw her out of the corner of his eye, his expression a mix of shock and desperation. "Pixa." "No." But she didn't stop. Skidding to a halt, she slammed the detonator onto the ground, triggering a buried charge beneath the figure's feet. The explosion sent them flying, their armor scorched and smoking. Jack took the opportunity to grab Pixa and pull her back toward the ship. "You're insane," he said, though there was a hint of pride in his voice. "I learned from the best," she shot back, her small chest heaving. As the dust settled, the figure rose to their feet, battered but alive. They gave Jack and Pixa a long, hard look before retreating to their ship. "This isn't over," they called out as the ramp closed behind them. Jack and Pixa watched in silence as the ship disappeared into the sky. When it was gone, Jack let out a long sigh and turned to her. "You've got guts, kid," he said, "but we're in deeper trouble now." Pixa nodded, her expression serious. "Then we'll fight. Together." Jack smiled faintly and ruffled her hair. "Yeah, together." As the iron will roared back to life and lifted off the plateau, Pixa stared out the viewport, her heart steady for the first time in years. She wasn't just a forgotten outcast anymore. She was a fighter, and with Jack by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next.